The National Bureau of Asian Research presents a podcast of the April 22, 2011 roundtable discussion on China's evolving intellectual property landscape with featured guest Dr. Richard P. Suttmeier. To hear more podcasts of NBR events, please visit our website at www.nbr.org.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our speaker series. I'm Cree Agnew, president of the Slade Gorton International Policy Center. And today at our speaker series event, it's a joint event with the Gorton Center and the Pyle Center, and you'll hear more about that in just a minute. So we're very informal. Slade, I want to welcome you. I'm glad you're here. And Professor Suttmeier, we welcome you, and we're really looking forward to hearing your comments today on China's evolving intellectual property landscape. So thank you for joining us. We'll ask Professor Suttmeier to speak for a few minutes. Slade has a few questions for him, and then we'll go ahead and open it up to the audience for questions. And if you would introduce yourself before you ask your question, we'd appreciate that. And just in front of you, you have a copy of Professor Suttmeier's bio, and you have a one-page description of the Gorton Center, as well as a one-page description of the Pyle Center. So I would like to turn it over to Travis Tanner to introduce our guest, and Travis is the director of the Pyle Center.
Great, thank you, Cree. Appreciate that, and thanks to everybody for taking the time to be here today. We really appreciate it. Senator Gorton, we're especially grateful to have you here to participate today. I'd like to provide just a brief introduction to the Pyle Center. The Pyle Center was founded in 2006 in honor of NBR's founding president, Dr. Ken Pyle, who's a professor at the University of Washington, and his wife. The Pyle Center conducts research on the security, political, and economic dynamics of Northeast Asia. Pyle Center projects are forward-looking. They include, we do a conference series on Chinese military modernization, a study on the emerging political leadership in East Asia, including a current phase of that project which seeks to identify future leaders in China and engage them directly. And then more recently, we've been tracking the ongoing U.S. and Japan joint efforts and collaborative response in response to the disaster in Japan. And then, of course, my favorite project, which is the one that has brought us all here together today, which is NBR's ongoing project looking at Chinese technology standards, innovation policy, and IP protection issues. NBR, just a little bit of background on the project. NBR began doing work on IP issues in China in the mid-1990s, so over 15 years ago, and that was under the guidance of the late giant of China studies, Professor Michael Oxenberg. The project featured a number of conferences in China, produced reports, policy papers, recommendations, and then about 6 years ago, the project had a kind of a change in focus and direction. I had the great privilege of beginning to work with Professor Suttmeier at that time. He's been the PI on several iterations of this project, looking specifically at standards issues, innovation policy issues, and what we're going to talk about today, which is IP protection and enforcement issues. Professor Suttmeier, the project has resulted, I should mention, for those of you that are interested, in a number of conferences. We've partnered with Tsinghua University to hold conferences in Beijing and Washington, D.C. We've produced a number of reports. For those of you that are interested, I'm happy to send those along to you as well. As Cree mentioned, we have the good fortune of having Professor Suttmeier with us here today. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Oregon. I always confused by emeritus because he continues to teach. That title he's teaching, and we got him up here from Eugene, but I understand that we'll cease soon. So we're grateful to have him here with us today. He's a political scientist by training. He's one of our nation's leading experts on science and technology development issues in China. He's widely published. He's testified before many congressional committees on the role of S&T in U.S.-China relations, including IP issues. And Professor Suttmeier's current research, which we'll talk about today and supported by NBR, is a study of China's intellectual property strategies and an examination of the changing nature of China's innovation system. He's well qualified to talk about this. Over the past year, he's made numerous research trips to China, including a 3-month stint as a visiting professor at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, one of the nation's premier academic institutions. And in fact, he just returned a few days ago from China, where he was a participant in a conference on precisely today's topic. So without further ado, I'll again thank you, Professor Suttmeier, for being here and turn the time over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Travis. It's very kind, very generous introduction. As you'll see, I I'm actually somewhat less of an IP specialist than I'm made out to be. But I come into this really more as a person interested in innovation and science and technology policy questions. But I think many of you know, in the last few years, the intellectual property component of this innovation strategy of China has become much more prominent. And in part because of lots of discussions with Chinese colleagues, when Travis asked me whether I'd be interested in doing something on this, I agreed to do it. I'm on a steep learning curve when it comes to things like IP law, but I'm learning a little bit at any rate. As he points out, I've been privileged to go to a number of conferences recently that turn out to be very effective ways of learning. But I'm coming into this thing, I think, with I'm a person who specializes in comparative politics and has done work on Japan in the past as well. And so I kind of come into it from the point of view of a technological catch-up, is the term I'm using. And looking at it in those terms, I think we can begin to see that China is not alone in the way it is trying to integrate intellectual property interests with technological development. There is, I think, in the literature an identifiable pattern which gives rise to the title of this talk on IT transition, where you start with countries in the very early stages of industrialization actively involved in copying and infringing. That seems to be a common pattern, as we've seen it in East Asia and a couple of places. Then gradually, countries, if they're successful, start building up their own technological capabilities, their own R&D capabilities. In time, that tends to produce new stakeholders, domestic stakeholders in innovation and in a stronger IP system. At the same time, you often see that these countries, certainly we've seen this in East Asia and we're seeing it with China, are also very much involved in an export orientation. The export orientation in turn engenders lots of IP conflicts with the target countries or the recipient countries. That further gives prominence to the IP issue. And then, if all goes well, one might say there's a kind of evolution towards a more harmonization of international approaches to IP. So the question I'm raising in this paper that I'm trying to write here is the extent to which that pattern is repeated in China. Right? It's clear that most of us, I think, when we think about IP in China, we think about infringement, we think about counterfeiting, we think about copying, and all of the problems and the billions of dollars of losses that engenders. But I think what I want to argue in all of this is that while that's still a matter of considerable concern, if that's all we think about in terms of where IP is going in China, we may be behind the curve in important ways. So what I'm asking is, does China follow this pattern? And if it doesn't, what's different? What seems to be going on in China? I won't go too deeply into all this, but as some of you know, there is a very major national effort, major national commitment in China to build up scientific and technological capabilities in support of what has been called frequently, quote, indigenous innovation, a term that I think is now gotten very, very tired. I would prefer, I think, to use the term sovereign innovation, actually. But it has a number of different components. It has a big R&D thrust to it. There are a number of big national projects. R&D spending is going up, and by 2020, China is trying to target 2.5% of GDP going to R&D, which is going to be a lot of money given the size of the GDP. Already this year, China's GDP ratio of R&D to GDP is somewhere about 1.7, 1.8%. But again, given the size, that means an awful lot of money going into R&D. And in fact, arguably, and this was very clear to me when I was there this past winter, it's probably too much money. There's money sloshing around all over the place to the point that it's wasted, it's leading to corruption and all kinds of other things. But nevertheless, this is a very serious long-term project. Now, in the outline of this so-called medium to long-term plan, 15-year plan from 2006 to 2020, the intellectual property and technical standards are explicitly identified as important things to do. So, not surprisingly, this earlier work we did on standards fits very nicely into all of this. China clearly thinks that in order to be a strong power in science and technology, it has to be very active in setting technical standards. And what it wants to do more and more is to ensure that its own intellectual property is at the foundation of those standards. So you see lots of explicit attention to that. At the same time, this long-term plan has been accompanied by, first of all, a series of industrial policies that have given many of us heartburn, and certainly many companies, many officials in Washington. This is the so-called indigenous innovation issues that affects procurement and market access questions more generally. Been a subject of considerable high-level bilateral discussion. So you have those implementing policies, and then as part of that, there are some very special strategies to support this overall 15-year plan, including a national human resource development strategy. So the Chinese are very conscious of the importance of building high-level human capital for innovation. And then there is a very explicit intellectual property strategy that was introduced first in 2008. And I'll talk about that just a little bit. But let's just, before doing that, talk a bit also about some of the more recent statements of objectives that are accompanying the announcement of the recent announcement of the 5-year plan, which some of you may know, the 12th 5-year plan, which just starting will run to 2015. A couple of things struck me about this plan is, one is a new state council decision on so-called cultivation and developing emerging strategic industries, a new state council guidance on the development of software and integrated circuit industries, a new set of policies to support cultural and creative industries that will be very copyright intensive, I believe. And then some other things, for instance, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, where I had been, is introducing a big new Innovation 2020 program, which, again, I think is intended to sort of push or leapfrog into positions of technological leadership. All of these initiatives, now very, very well funded, have very strong intellectual property and standards objectives as well. So if we look at just the new and emerging strategic industries, the 7 areas that have been identified are energy efficiency and environmental protection. That's the first one, next generation ICT. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Range of biotechnology industry, high-end equipment, including things like the big airplane project, space, ocean exploration, things like that. New energy, in this case in particular, new forms of nuclear power, new generation nuclear power, new materials, and then next generation automobiles. This is, of course, the electric car stuff in particular. So all of these things, I think you can expect very, very robust IP and standards initiatives following from them. I won't say too much about that, but as an example of the new initiatives in the ICT area, there's a lot of interest in the so-called Internet of Things. Lots of money going into that. And if you look at the discussion of the Internet of Things idea, you see, for instance, the formation of a national initiative on standardization that brings together some 24 partners from industry, government, and academia, and such guidance as the need to, quote, introduce the Internet of Things standards of China to the whole world. So again, the notion of Chinese standards becoming internationalized. If you look at the software and integrated circuit policies, among the comments that are attendant to that policy are statements such as accelerate the industrialization, promotion, and application of technologies with independent indigenous intellectual property. Okay. So the IP strategy document of 2008, I think, has not gotten quite as much attention as it might have, and in part because it sort of reads like some old-style Chinese policy statement. In discussing this with an IP lawyer with a big European multinational in Shanghai recently, I asked him, I said, what do you think about it? He said, well, initially it was just sort of more blah, 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 that we've heard before. But he said, as you begin to look and see what's happening, it's reason to take it seriously. The IP document identifies actually 4 objectives for an IP strategy. 1, to create intellectual property along the lines I've been talking about. 2nd, to use it. 3rd, manage it. And then 4thly, protect it. So all of these things will be getting attention. But I think in addition to the protection, which is itself quite important in all this, the emphasis on creation, on the R&D side of things, but then very much on the use and management is very important. So what we're seeing is big programs in training patent agents, we're beginning to see the appearance of IP brokers, people like that, a whole series of IP service industries emerging, not to mention attorneys as well. The patent strategy, which follows the IP strategy, was introduced just last year in 2010, a separate one. And again, it's interesting just to note some of these things. In this case, you see lots and lots of attention to numerical targets, almost a little reminiscent of the old state planning system. In this case, quoting, the annual quantity of applications for patents for inventions, utility models, and designs will reach 2 million. This is by 2015. China will rank among the top 2 in the world in terms of the annual number of patents on inventions granted to the domestic applicants, and the quality of patents filed further improved. By 2015, improvements will have been made in the patent examination system, something that we might also begin to think about a little bit, such that the average period for examining an invention patent application will be reduced to 22 months, with the examination period for utility models being reduced to 3 months. The quality of the patent examination and granting process should rank with the best IP bureaus in the world by 2015. So, in short, you're seeing very, very serious high-level attention being given to this whole intellectual property strategy. And you're seeing, I think, already some consequences coming out of this. First, an explosive growth in patent activity. You can begin to look at numbers, but it's a really very, very significant upward trajectory. The development of human resources for all phases of this, as I said, the R&D side, the management side, the protection side. Local government is very active in all of this stuff. And that's quite important, because one of the great problems, as some of you know, I think, is that, especially with regard to enforcement, there's been a big disconnect between national objectives and actual what happens on the ground. But local government is, this is, I think, a very complicated matter, just how this all plays out, because on one hand, they will be charged with protection and enforcement questions more so, but they're also very much charged with the creation and management side. So one of the things we're seeing is that, for instance, SIPO, the National State Intellectual Property Office, is running all kinds of programs to train up and to influence local governments to become much more active in the IP management thing in support of national innovation objectives. Whether that is consistent with the kinds of IP regime that one wants to see in China, I think remains to be seen, but it clearly it requires some attention. So we have that. Legal developments, the court system, I think, has gotten stronger, and in some jurisdictions, judges have become quite expert. There is more of a specialized IP court now developing. Litigation is increasing almost as fast as patenting, and that's, I think, very important. I think there are signs of a changing culture of IP in some quarters, and you're beginning to see, I think, the appearance of these stakeholders, both in the patent side and what I would argue in terms of the next 5-year plan, probably in the copyright side as well. More and more Chinese innovators and creators who want and will demand much stronger IP protection, and so forth. I'm going to go on too long here, I guess, but some significant things are beginning to happen. So I'll just sort of close, I think, with and elaborate on any of this as we go forward, but raising a couple of kinds of questions. Are we going to see China, given these forces at work now, moving towards a system or a regime in China that is more harmonious, more compatible with international IP regimes, or are we going to see something very different? One of the things that begins to strike me when you look at the growth of patenting activities and the growth of litigation, given other aspects of Chinese society, the nature of conflict in Chinese society, I wonder a little bit whether China is moving towards a kind of IP overload world, right, where everything is going to be a contested set of things in a way that actually is going to undercut their own innovation system. So a lot of interesting questions that tied up with all of that, but maybe this is a good place to stop, you think, and we want to have plenty of discussion.
Sure.
Okay, let's, if I may, that's a wonderful introduction to what's going on in China. Let's talk about its effect on us. Last November, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce had a publication that said, among other things, that China's proposed policies are a blueprint for technology theft on a scale the world has never seen before. End quote. Do you agree? And if so, what should we be doing about it?
Well, that came from a study that James McGregor did, I guess, and in some ways he did a very nice job, I think, in that study. I think maybe he went a little overboard with that kind of conclusion. I mean, in some ways, the scale, of course, is the biggest the world has ever seen because China is the biggest the world has ever seen as an emerging economy. But I think that what I'm trying to suggest here is that there is this sort of interesting point that we're at now where the hunger for technology continues, but it's one of the explicit objectives of this long-term plan is, in fact, to substitute Chinese science and technology for foreign technology. Now, if you then look and you say, well, what about some of these big R&D programs? One of the striking things about them is that the foreign presence is very, very deep. If you look at, for instance, the large aircraft program, for instance, which has lots and lots of foreign participation with lots and lots of intellectual property flowing into China as a result of that. Is that theft? I don't think it's all theft. Is there coercive means being used to try to get that technology? I think the answer is yes. But the scale is very big. There's no doubt about that, I would say.
Well, let me press on the same question then. What kind of response should we have? Perhaps there are two separate things in this connection. One is just the pure theft, the pure taking Microsoft's IP and utilizing it and selling it back. And the second is just the requirements that are imposed on U.S. corporations or other foreign corporations in doing business in China of giving up so much intellectual property. Are these things about which we should be concerned and should take some form of action?
I think absolutely. The question, I guess, is who should take the action and how do you parse out the responsibilities, right? I mean, I think that one thing we should always remember is that the question of sharing IP and technology transfer, I think, ultimately is kind of a business decision. I'm not entirely convinced that Microsoft or GE or whoever you want to talk about is this sort of, hopeless, helpless little weakling before the Chinese government. I think in many ways, from the Chinese point of view, they feel that these companies are doing quite well. China is the weakling, and it needs to be somehow the balance has to be redressed. But I think that companies have to, first of all, pay much more attention to their IP strategy in China. And that involves, for instance, filing a lot more patents, among other things. They have to have, I think, an awful lot more attention to due diligence and how they proceed. I think they have to watch the terms of their joint venture contracts very, very carefully. But I think you start looking at some of these cases, GE's involvement, for instance, with the big aircraft program where they've gotten involved with the avionics. It's somewhat controversial. I think some people in GE thought that they're giving away the store in terms of IP. But at any rate, I think that there is a lot of stuff that companies have to do. Now, the other question, I think, by implication, I gather, is whether the U.S. government should be doing more. And I'm not so sure. We do quite a lot, right? We engage the Chinese in all these kinds of issues. Should we have some kind of retaliatory mechanism to use? Well, we're engaged, we're involved with various international agreements, and when we have violations of those agreements, we have to push forward on them. But I do think that the more significant, the two things I think are more important actually are this kind of continuing engagement with China on innovation issues, for one thing. Second of all, we have to do something domestically. Right? We have to ensure that our own innovation system remains very robust, and we're not doing that. So, from the Chinese point of view, what can they say? They say, well, we look to you folks for all this technology, all this innovation, but what's happening with your own innovation system? So something has to happen there, I would say, as well.
And you would, although this is slightly off your point, you would not agree with, say, the policies advocated by Senator Schumer with respect to the valuation of Chinese currency, and to take some kind of retaliatory action in connection with that?
I probably wouldn't agree with that. Yeah. I'm not convinced that the current valuation issue is so critical to the trade question, actually. And I would add, the other thing that I think you have to keep in mind in all of this is that I think there's a lot of industry difference. If you go to Beijing and you talk to people in the ICT area, you hear one kind of a story. You go to Shanghai and you're talking to people in chemicals and manufacturing and other things, I think you hear a different kind of story. I think industry differences make a big deal. For some companies, the problems of piracy are just getting intolerable. For others, it's a kind of minor annoyance, and they don't really worry too much about losing the crown jewels. And in part, again, it depends on the industry. I think some industries are able to kind of disaggregate their critical technologies in ways that they can protect some and share others without being too concerned.
Earlier in your remarks in passing, you mentioned that there may be too much money too fast in much of this R&D, and that it is either caused or accompanied by a great deal of corruption. Can you enlarge on that a little bit? To what extent is that going to be disabling? To what extent is it a fundamental problem, rather than just people taking some money off the top?
Well, I personally think it's a fundamental problem. China, people know about it in China. Part of the problem, I think, has been highlighted by a few Chinese researchers who have returned to China and now are trying to reform the system. But there's a lot of, I think, understanding of the problem, and what we're seeing at the moment is various discussions going on about reforming the budgeting system and the R&D management system and so forth like that. So maybe something will come out of it. On the other hand, the corruption is so pervasive, and it goes to such fundamental issues of what we mean by truth, how we go about recognizing truth, how we go about publishing papers. The problems of academic misconduct are very severe. So there's something very rotten about the whole system, actually, by my view, and in the view of, I think, a lot of Chinese, for that matter.
I'm going to pause, let someone else start. Rich's answers is all get out. So I'll turn it to him.
So one of the fundamental issues, it seems to me, and this would be probably bridging Slade's concerns too, is the independence of rule of law and its effect on IP enforcement and the judges, the court system, and all this stuff. I mean, I assume it's corrupt also if an American company goes up against a company in which the judge and the mayor and God knows what have some interest, which may be very common, very common. How does this, I know you're not, you said you were not a lawyer, but from your observation, to what extent, and you suggested Americans have to file patents and so on, well, good Lord, sharing their patent information with a corrupt patent system, which is a main line to God knows what in the country. So what's a company to do? How independent, how sanguine are you about a company's prospects for filing for patents, getting true protection versus Chinese competitors?
Well, I think, first of all, one of the striking things is that most of the litigation is China versus China, Chinese versus Chinese, and the number of foreigners involved in court cases is relatively small in the patent area. And when you look at, and I've got some of the data on this which I haven't fully analyzed, but when you look at some of this data on court cases, the Western companies win sometimes. But then if you talk to the companies, one of the things that they're very aware of is you have to choose your venue very carefully. So I think there is an emerging wisdom, on the street among IP lawyers serving Western companies about which venues are more reliable than others. And in some of them, I think the feeling is that the people are very, very professionalized, and you can count on fair treatment. In others, I think probably you cannot. But I think what the other part of your question is a very interesting one, and I think again it sort of goes to this question of how rotten things really are, and that is, you have, as one young scholar of IP pointed out to me, he said, there really is kind of a difference between the intellectual property world in China and the innovation world. Now, government policy is trying to push them together, but the innovation policy people, these are the ones who are going out there and doing the manipulating government procurement questions and changing the foreign investment regulations like that. Whereas the IP people are really trying to bring the whole system into some standard of international respectability. And so I think there is some sense of disagreement about all of that. But then, you come up with this interesting question. Can you have a credible commercial property system, and including IP, in a country where the overall rule of law is so dreadful, right? Is there some fundamental problem or disconnect between having a vigorous IP system and a human rights system that has no law? And you could go on and on in other areas as well.
I think that's a great point at this to thank you very, very much for an intellectually extremely stimulating time. We appreciate your coming up here from Oregon, and we'll look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.